Howdy folks, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles. Just a warning before we get started, you might hear some strange noises in the background. And even if you didn't, now that I've mentioned it, you're going to be listening out for them. Britain's in the grip of a fairly nasty storm at the moment, and so you may hear some rain on the window outside, and there's absolutely nothing I can do about that, I'm afraid. Anyway, today we have Flashpoint in the French Tier 10 destroyer, the Kleber. He's divisioned up with Jokerface 71 in the German Tier 10 destroyer, the Z52. This is a Tier 10 battle. I mean, obviously it's a Tier 10 battle, they're both in Tier 10 destroyers, but there are no Tier 9s or 8s on either team. There is a carrier in play. His team has an Audacious, the British Tier 10 carrier. The enemy team have a Midway, the US Navy Tier 10 carrier. So, funny story about the Kleber. You may not believe this, but, well, how can I put this? There's a phrase that gets bandied around in World of Tanks and World of Warships. I'm sure you've heard of it. The phrase is Russian bias. As far as World of Warships is concerned, people look at the fact that the game's developed by a Russian company, and then they look at ships like the Smolensk, the Stalingrad, and the Kremlin as examples of Russian bias. Now, whether or not you do or don't believe that Russian bias actually exists in World of Warships, or World of Tanks for that matter, isn't really the point. Although you could look at the three ships that I just mentioned as examples and you'd have to agree that they are pretty good ships. With the Smolensk in particular being the flavour of the month Russian bias ship that everybody loves to hate the most, and for good reason. Although at the same time, I could just as easily point to the French Tier 10 Colbert, another Tier 10 cruiser, high explosive spammer that's just as annoying to deal with as the Smolensk, but people don't really complain about the Colbert because you hardly ever see the Colbert. It's significantly harder to get a hold of than the Smolensk, and you see a lot of Smolensks. Similarly, it wasn't that long ago that people were pointing to the Tier 10 Soviet destroyer, the Khabarovsk, as an example of clear Soviet bias in World of Warships 2. But that ship has been power creeped pretty hard, funnily enough, mostly by this thing, the Kleber, and these days you'd have to look long and hard to find anybody who'd be prepared to point at the Khabarovsk as an example of Russian bias with a straight face. And with that introduction aside, now we get to the funny part of the story, because Russian bias is, believe it or not, and I'm not making this up, a thing on the Russian server as well. Russian players also believe that there is Russian bias in World of Warships, but the funny part of the story is that they believe the bias is against the Russian Navy. Yes, you heard me right the first time. In a game where the Kremlin, the Smolensk and the Stalingrad exist, Russian players believe that the game is biased against them. And one of the ships that they point to as proof of this is the Kleber. Now, when you finish choking on your cornflakes, I know, but hang on a second. They might have a point. Let's look at the evidence. First, this is the fastest ship in the game. The days when the Shimakaze was the speed demon of World of Warships have been over for a long time. This thing, running its engine boost and with a speed flag, will top out at over 55 knots. It can outrun some torpedoes. Not its own torpedoes though, because its own torpedoes have a speed of 75 knots. And it carries 12 of them in 4 launchers, and they each do over 18,000 damage. Their range is kind of limited though, it's only 8 kilometers, but it's still possible to stealth torpedo, as the enemy Kremlin over there. Appropriately enough, it's a Kremlin found out the hard way. Even though the Kleber does have terrible concealment with the right build and equipment, oh lordy lordy. Yeah, the Kremlin just caught another face full of torpedoes. But yes, with the correct build and equipment, you are able to stealth torpedo in the Kleber, although you only have a 1 kilometer window of opportunity to get your torpedoes away undetected, but, well, Flashpoint just managed it. So, yeah, the ship does have lousy concealment, but you're still able to conduct stealth torpedo attacks. And if you do get spotted, you're a bugger to hit because you can top out at over 55 knots. And in case I hadn't sunk in by now, just to put that kind of speed into perspective, that's not much less than double the top speed of an Akizuki. And while the Kleber doesn't have access to a torpedo reload booster, it doesn't really need one because it's got 12 torpedoes in the first place, and it only takes 77 seconds to reload them, and that's before you start tinkering around with equipment fits and commander skills to get that even shorter. That Kremlin hasn't learnt his lesson, by the way, and he's not the only one, because that is a double strike. He sacked the enemy gearing as well, so that's a good start. You may have noticed a couple of flares popping up from the ship and some special talents being activated. That's because Flashpoint is running Philippe Abonneur, the unique French commander, as the captain of his Kleber. So on a devastating strike, the fully armed talent just activated, so he now has 5% faster reload on his guns. We'll talk about the guns in a moment. Earlier you saw him getting the Sparks of Resistance talent, which activates on earning a captured or capture assist ribbon. And every time he does that, it increases the fire chance of his high explosive shells by 1%. But back to those torpedoes. You'll note that Flashpoint is divisioned up with a Z-52, the German Tier 10 destroyer, and that's quite appropriate because I just want to put the Kleber's torpedoes into context by using the Z-52 as a comparison and an example. Because one of the things that made the Z-52 special, the Z-52's party piece, if you like, was the very fast reload of its torpedoes. But the Z-52's torpedoes take 90 seconds to reload, which is still pretty quick. But the Kleber's only take 77 seconds, and the Kleber carries 3 more of them, and they're faster, and they do more damage. Meanwhile, Flashpoint and Joker Face there in the Z-52 have been hydroed by, I think, the Smolensk coming around the corner. Joker Face is counter-hydroing him, but it's pretty obvious he's coming out for a fight. Now, if you're in any kind of destroyer, being attacked by a Smolensk is a very, very scary experience. Flashpoint is only really going to survive this encounter because the Smolensk is focusing down Joker Face first. And unfortunately for Joker Face, while he probably wasn't going to survive it anyway, he definitely didn't because he wasn't running a detonation flag. The thing is, the Kleber bites back, and fighting a Kleber is not a walk in the park for a Smolensk either, particularly when it's running its reload booster and it manages to start scoring citadels. Even so, now that the Smolensk has finished with Joker Face and is returning fire, it is capable of doing a huge amount of damage, even to the destroyer with the most health of all Tier 10 destroyers. Yes, that's the Kleber too. So Flashpoint very wisely decides that discretion is the better form of valour here, and since he is still hydroed and the smokescreen isn't helping anybody, he ducks in behind the island. Did we mention that the Kleber has the most health of any Tier 10 destroyer? Yes, it does. And if you have Philippe Abonneur as your captain, and you run the survivability expert skill, which Flashpoint is doing, you have a shit ton more health than any other destroyer in the game. Nearly 26,000 in this case. It's at this point where I'd like to ask the question, why does that Grosser Kurfürst even bother running hydroacoustic search? Because that is his hydro. So he's the one who's detecting... Yeah? What exactly was he hoping to achieve by that? Because I'm out of ideas. If you're the one running the hydroacoustic search, so you're the one spotting the destroyer that's lurking around the side of the island that you're hidden behind, how can that have possibly caught you by surprise? I just don't understand. Because the only way that can possibly make any kind of sense whatsoever is if that Grosser Kurfürst was quite literally playing the game by just rolling his face over the keyboard and pressing buttons at random. So, kill number 3, not far short of 200,000 damage done, and he hasn't really fired his guns much yet. Which is kind of amusing because people don't really think of the Kleber as a torpedo boat, even though its torpedoes are amazing. Oh, by the way, here's something else about World of Warships that you may not realise, but which is absolutely true and makes no sense whatsoever. You'll note that he's trying to cap. He's going for a second Sparks of Resistance talent activation to get his chance of fire on target with a high explosive shell up to 12%. The Grosser Kurfürst back there is constantly getting reset. He's finally managed to cap anyway. because even though the gross occur first was getting reset, he wasn't, right? Yeah, it doesn't actually work like that in World of Warships. Oh, we'll come back to that in a moment. For now, there's that pesky Smolensk. Broadside on, armor piercing loaded, main battery reload booster activated, and just watch how quickly he's capable of disposing of that enemy light cruiser. Yeah, that was fairly scary, really, wasn't it? But anyway, back to the capture mechanics in World of Warships. You know how in World of Tanks, if there are two tanks in a cap circle and one of them keeps getting hit, only that one tank's capture points is reset. The other tank that isn't getting hit, maybe because it hasn't been spotted, keeps capping at the normal rate. That doesn't happen in World of Warships. In World of Warships, if you're in a cap circle, let's say you're an undetected destroyer, and you're sharing that cap circle with an extremely detected battleship, let's say a gross occur first, and the gross occur first keeps getting hit, that also slows down your capture progress, even if you're undetected and nobody's shooting at you. Sounds absolutely mad, doesn't it? There is a method to the madness, I suppose. It's not like World of Tanks, where if you're in a cap circle and you're capping and you get hit, you lose all of your capture points. In World of Warships, if you're capping and you get hit, you only lose some of your capture points. You actually lose quite a lot of your capture points, but not all of them. But it's worth thinking about if, for example, there's a undetected destroyer busy capping for your team, and you're in a great big, difficult to not see from several kilometers away battleship, maybe think twice before entering the cap circle, because you might end up doing more harm than good. I think it's about time we talked about the Kleber's guns. You saw the new arsehole he ripped into the Smolensk just then, but those were really the best possible circumstances. A light cruiser with a citadel, broadside on, grounded, 8,000 damage salvos. You shouldn't expect to do that every time. But these guns are still pretty scary, especially if the main battery reload booster is off cooldown. Because when it was active, it got his rate of fire against that Smolensk down to about 2.3 seconds with all 8 of his 139mm guns, and that caliber is significant. Because 1mm more, and these guns wouldn't be able to get the full benefit from both the basic and advanced firing training skills. And that main battery reload booster has a fairly quick cooldown as well. 1 minute and I think 35 seconds, which is no time at all in a game of World of Warships. And extremely bad news for the Yu Yang, who quite literally has nothing here. He couldn't possibly outgun a Kleber, even if the Kleber wasn't, and he is, running his main battery reload booster, and he's a Pan-Asian destroyer, so deep water torpedoes, he wouldn't even be able to defend himself with torpedoes. So that was kill number 5 in the Kraken Unleashed. The Yoshino is paying no attention whatsoever to him. The Midway, however, is, although this is a depleted squadron of dive bombers, and they scored some damage, but they would have had to get extremely lucky there to finish him off with the one drop. This is just about the only really bad thing about the Kleber, with the exception of its terrible concealment, which to a degree doesn't really matter that much because it can still stealth torpedo, and it's so fast and has so much health that even if you can see it, hitting it and killing it are two entirely different things. But it does have pretty bad AA. But even then I really need to qualify that statement, because it does have pretty good continuous anti-aircraft damage within the range of its anti-aircraft guns, but its guns don't produce any flak. Now how much of a disadvantage that is entirely open to interpretation, because any semi-competent aircraft carrier player can dodge flak. You can't dodge the continuous damage from the AA guns, which is pretty good. The Kleber's biggest disadvantage against aircraft is more down to its concealment rating rather than any deficiencies with its anti-aircraft guns, because it can actually be outspotted by aircraft outside the range of its anti-aircraft guns. I suppose one other bad thing that you could say about this ship is that it does have a fairly large turning circle. But, well, if you were travelling at 55 knots, you'd probably have a fairly large turning circle as well, and you probably wouldn't really consider that too much of a disadvantage, because you're travelling at 55 knots, and you can outrun torpedoes. And anybody shooting at you can't do so fully zoomed in, regardless of how far away you are, because you're moving so fast that in order to be able to give enough lead to hit you at any range, you have to pull the camera back in order to be able to aim far enough ahead of a Kleber in order to actually hit the thing when it's moving at full speed. So I think we can accept a fairly large turning circle in comparison to other tier down destroyers if that's the only real downside to running this ship. And there's kill number 6. Jesus. So, on a World of Warships server, not too far away from most of us, there are lots and lots and lots of Russian players who genuinely believe that Russian bias is a thing in World of Warships, except their interpretation of Russian bias is that the game's Russian developers are biased against the ships of their own nation, because ships like this exist. And when you take into account the fact that the French also have battleships that can outrun destroyers, and battleships that have better DPM than some cruisers, well, I don't know. Maybe they have a point. Let me know what you think in the comments. French bias, is it a thing in World of Warships? And if it is, this is probably the first time we've heard of it. Unless, of course, you're on the Russian server. That's it for today. Hope you enjoyed it, and as always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.